Some say the oldest lesson begins with a question. What is wealth if it cannot be kept within a hand and shared with a neighbor? It is told that in a valley ringed by soft hills, the village of Nara answered that question every year with a celebration. And tonight, the valley held its breath for an answer, as a choice would soon appear. Nara was not famous or large, but it was rich in rituals. Each year the people gathered to honor the harvest with candles, stories, and a shared table that passed from hand to hand, reminding everyone that plenty was a circle, not a tower. The tradition moved through every home, and the village lived with the steady rhythm of seasons, until one autumn when a new restlessness found its way into the market, and the hush before decision lengthened. At the village edge lived Mira, an elder whose hands had learned the scales of need and mercy, and across the lane, Harlan, a man who had recently prospered and learned to measure his worth in size and shine. Mira believed in measured cheer that bound neighbors, while Harlan began to believe that grandeur alone could mark his legacy, and the air between them trembled with an unspoken question about how the festival should be held. When the season's first chill arrived, the village council met under the elder elm, and Harlan spoke of a feast the valley would not forget, a display to make Nara shine beyond its hills, while Mira offered a quieter plan. Enough for everyone, no waste, and time to teach the young the ways of shared measure. Voices rose and fell like wind through grain, and the village found itself leaning toward two very different kinds of celebration, as a quiet tension settled in the night. Harlan painted pictures with his words, overflowing platters, music that would echo in every home, dishes carried from distant fields, and towering candles that would make the hill glow like a second dawn. Many hearts were tempted by the luster, for it promised praise and the feeling of importance. Yet Mira, with a quiet hand, reminded them that every gift has its price, and that to spend the future's grain for a single night is to borrow warmth at the cost of next winter's hearths, and her warning lingered like smoke. Some say that moments of choice reveal themselves as small cracks, a mother counting jars, a child asking why not enough, the farmer pausing with the sack half filled because his neighbor needs seed. The village heard those small sounds and felt Harlan's plan pull at them, while Mira's measured voice reminded them of the long arc of need, and the festival preparations quietly began to show the direction of their hearts as the seed of consequence took root. As autumn deepened, ropes of leaves and painted stones appeared along the paths, and men and women took to preparing both plans, some quietly baking bread for every hand, others crafting ornate platters that would dwarf the table. The work sounded like music, but under it lay a debate that tightened with every knot tied, and the village watched the festival grow in two different hands, with each knot a question of whose measure would hold, as clouds began to gather on the horizon. Harlan used his stores to commission grand pieces, silvered bowls, honeyed cakes glazed with bright fruits, and drums that promised to drum away small worries with loud sound. Many young folk were dazzled and began to believe that this display could be the village's destiny. Yet every polished bowl required grain, and every bright fruit meant another field scratched thin, and the promises of brightness began to cast long shadows on the storehouses as murmurs of unease threaded through the market. Mira and those who followed her mended robes made small loaves and planned a single table that would wind through the square, so that elders and children could pass dishes from hand to hand. Their work spoke of rhythm and restraint, teaching apprentices how to count portions and how to set aside seed for the spring. And their quiet workshops hummed with a different kind of hope, one that stretched beyond the festival night as gentle rain began to patter on the roofs. Knees settled in corners where stores emptied quietly. A shepherd counted fewer lambs, a potter postponed a kiln, and a few families whispered about debts they had kept hidden beneath rugs. The festival's coming exposed differences like stones in a road. Some could pour out their stores without fear, while others tightened the last knot of their purse, and the gulf between them grew like fog, thickening the air as the winds rose in the hills. Then came rain that would not be satisfied. It fell long and heavy, soaking the stored grain and swelling the well beyond its bounds, and farmers stood in muddy fields to watch what silt and flood might take. Some stores, carefully kept, preserved seed in raised bins, while Harlan's new fruits and fine cakes, made for display, were more vulnerable than anyone expected, and the village felt the first real measure of what true scarcity might demand, as talk of cutting back began to pass among the households. In a candle-lit night, as plans lay half-built and stores sat uneven across doorsills, the village felt its heart tilt toward a decision. Will they spend the last of some households for the glory of a few, or will they pare back brightness so the whole valley would have warmth? Mira's voice rose one more time like a small bell. To celebrate modestly is not to be small, she said, but to keep the circle whole. The next day would force a choice that would test that wisdom, with consequence hanging heavy in the wind. One night the river swelled beyond remembered bounds, and as villagers raced to shore up sacks and barrels, many found their stores heavy with water or swept away entirely. Harlan showpieces, crafted for sight and kept near the open air, were ruined, while some of Mira's careful caches survived in the raised bins she had long taught them to build. The loss was immediate and terrible, and in that dark hour the village learned that spectacle had a fragile heart, as the dawn would show both ruin and reason. At dawn the tally began, who had enough to share and who could not fill a child's cup. Neighbors discovered that some had given until their storehouses echoed hollow, while others had kept a careful reserve that could now be used to mend the village's wounds. The tally was not simply of grain and cloth, but of choices made in days before. Where measure was kept, there was room to help, and where measure had been spent for display, there lay a hard lesson in empty shelves as decisions made earlier cast long shapes ahead. Harlan walked the square with bowed shoulders, his bright dishes ruined and his stores thinned, and he met the eyes of those he had hoped to impress, only to find disappointment and weary need instead of awe. Pride had led him to borrow brightness, and in the dull light, his regret sounded like a child's voice asking for help. And in that moment, Harlan realized that wealth that cannot bind a village is a lonely, brittle thing, requiring a new kind of courage to mend. Mira did not celebrate another's ruin with a knowing tone. Instead, she opened her stores and taught how to divide without shame, showing how a single loaf could be quartered and passed, how a child could be fed without naming the giver. Her hands moved with the memory of seasons, and as neighbors received what they needed, the village began to feel its shape return, because modest giving had preserved not only grain, but also the practice of shared care, and the heart of community beat once more, steady and resolute. The council gathered again, not under the elm, but by the now mended well, and Harlan stood to speak differently. He admitted his mistake and offered what remained to rebuild the stores he had briefly emptied in the name of grandeur. Some hesitated to accept his help, but others saw that rebuilding meant changing the measure of how they celebrated, and so a new plan took root that would ask everyone to take less in the night and save more for the tomorrow, as a new resolve settled over the gathered faces. The turning point was simple and firm. The village would hold a modest celebration, a single winding table and candles enough to warm faces but not to dazzle, and each family would bring what they could without emptying their future stores. It was a choice that cost Harlan his show, but bought the village a durable rhythm. And in that choice, the people understood that wisdom often asks us to resist the immediate praise to keep the community whole, with consequence now held like a taut rope between them. The night of the festival was not empty of joy, but its joy was quieter and deeper. Candles flickered along the winding table. Children told stories they had learned by heart, and elders passed down songs that spoke of careful hands and patient fields. Plates were modest but full where it counted, and the sharing of small portions taught a new generation that celebration could bind rather than divide, as laughter rose gently into a sky washed clean by recent rains. Harlan did not vanish into shame. Instead, he apprenticed himself to those who mended the seed stores and learned how to count a season instead of a night, turning his hands to work that rebuilt what his show had borrowed. His transformation was not immediate but visible, and villagers who had once hung on his words now watched as he measured out grain with Mira at his side, learning that reputation grown through service endures longer than reputation built on display, and that humility is the currency of repair. Children learn the art of portioning and of saving a kernel for seed rather than a single feast, and elders gave simple parables about measures and seasons that would slip easily into arising minds. The village made teaching part of the festival itself, so that modest celebration became not a punishment but a practiced virtue, and the young began to see that balance is a craft learned as much by hands as by speech, as a new quiet pride took root. The village established small rituals, a single candle for every household, a bowl that passed from elder to child, and a moment where the giver did not speak their name, so that gratitude and responsibility were woven together without pride. These rituals felt like tiny anchors in years to come, steadying decisions about trade, sharing, and the use of stores, and slowly, Mira rebuilt a life where celebration and thrift walked hand in hand, as seasons taught them patient timing. Years later, travelers would pass by and hear the tale in a hush. The village that once chased brilliance but learned to celebrate modestly, and the voice that told it added, "Some say the wise do not merely save for themselves, but teach others how to keep the circle whole." The whisper carried like seed across fields and into other valleys, and Mira's quiet lesson began to bloom in small ways beyond its hills, as wisdom finds ways to travel on soft feet. In the end, the parable closes with a clear measure. The village that celebrated modestly was not poorer, but richer in ways that mattered. For its held-together circle survived storms and taught successive children how to weigh joy against tomorrow. The lesson is simple and direct. Greed seeks brightness that fades, while wisdom tends the stores that last, and the village's modest celebration became a living answer to the opening riddle. A conclusion that teaches us how to live with balance and care, followed by practical lessons for managing wealth and measure.